Happy National Library Week, and welcome to a conversation with the one and only Dan Rather, brought to you today by United for Libraries, Booklist, and the American Library Association. My name is David Page, and I have the honor of serving as president of United for Libraries, the National Association of Library Trustees, Advocates, Friends, and Foundations. Our essential mission here at United for Libraries is to educate, guide, and rally the hundreds of thousands of library supporters in our nation who govern, promote, advocate, and fundraise for libraries of all types. United for Libraries encourages community participation in library support organizations to elevate the profile of libraries' vital work. With this mission in mind, we at United for Libraries could not be more thrilled at the opportunity to welcome a true dyed-in-the-wool library advocate to inspire us all, Dan Rather. In his book, What Unites Us, Mr. Rather writes of our past. There was a belief that our civic discourse should be infused with informed and well-reasoned arguments. This has been a fundamental cornerstone of our democracy, stretching back to the birth of the United States. He goes on to write, "What I learned as a young child, and it's a lesson I have seen repeated countless times, is that a democracy requires open access to ideas." That nexus that Mr. Rather introduces between democracy, access, intellectual freedom, and civic discourse in our communities sits right at the heart of everything we do in our libraries. In my years as a trustee here in my beautiful home state of New Hampshire, whenever we faced a challenge and I needed to recenter on the value of my work and find motivation, I would always turn again to our state governing statute for public libraries, which begins, "Mindful that knowledge and learning, generally diffused through a community, are essential to the preservation of a free government. The legislature recognizes its duty to encourage the people to extend their education during and beyond the years of formal education. To this end, it hereby declares that the public library deserves adequate financial support from government at all levels." That linkage that Mr. Rather describes between our core library values and the health of our democracy is not just accidental. It is the very founding principle of our work in libraries. And the linkage that my home state makes between library value and library funding is also critical. Taking action for libraries ensures their future for the entire community. Before we get started, we would like to thank Algonquin Books and Workman Publishing for making this event possible, specifically Deborah Lynn of Algonquin and Annie Mazes, who handles library marketing at Algonquin and Workman Publishing. Also, thanks to them, What Unites Us is available for purchase at a discount of 50% through April 30th. Please see the link in the chat to order.
Not ready yet.
And I now have the pleasure of introducing to you one of our great leaders in libraries, American Library Association President Julius C. Jefferson, Jr. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. The American Library Association is pleased to join United for Libraries in welcoming you on Take Action for Libraries Day for a special conversation with Dan Rather. Even if you've never seen CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, or 48 Hours or 60 Minutes, even if you don't follow the provocative tweets from @DanRather, if you consume any kind of media, you know this living legend of a man. Dan Rather is here to talk about what unites us, his book by that name, but also how libraries embody that phrase. Libraries unite us by welcoming everyone, whether it's in a K through 12 school, on a college campus, or in the local public library. That's why people from all walks of life and communities across the country are celebrating National Library Week. I love seeing so many social media posts and news stories about what your libraries and your library workers mean to you. When we say that libraries make an enormous difference in our communities, then we must take action to support them. That's why we're hosting this event on Take Action for Libraries Day. In his chapter on books, Dan Rather says this: to be sure, words are not enough on their own. We need to find out what our libraries need most and what the opportunities are, and then advocate for that at your state and local level of decision making. All of us, no matter where we live, can ask our elected leaders in the US Congress to support libraries. Today, on Take Action for Libraries Day, the American Library Association is asking you to take 2 actions for libraries. Just go to ala.org/takeaction. First of all, ask your representative and your 2 senators to provide full funding for the only dedicated source of federal support for American libraries. Each year, the federal government designates a modest amount of funding for state libraries to distribute so local libraries can offer programs that make our communities strong. But that federal funding is not automatic. We have to advocate for those funds every year.
Andy.
You can add your voice on ala.org/takeaction. Another action we can all take is to ask our elected leaders in Congress to co-sponsor the Build America's Libraries Act of 2021. The bill would provide $5 billion to repair, modernize, and construct library facilities in underserved and marginalized communities. As we move into pandemic recovery, library facilities are being used for vaccine registration and distribution, broadband access, telehealth, in addition to all the other ways library spaces are traditionally used for communities. We are overwhelmed with demand for our facilities as well as our services. So right now, federal leaders are thinking about how to invest in our nation's infrastructure. Libraries are American infrastructure and deserve to have HVAC systems that work, accessibility for patrons with disabilities, and buildings that reflect the vitality that libraries provide to communities. Again, you can ask your members of Congress to co-sponsor the Build America's Libraries Act by going to ala.org/takeaction. If we believe that libraries do transform, we must take action to support them. And ALA is proud to host a library advocate of Dan Rather's caliber for a conversation about the role of libraries in our democracy and how we can ensure their vibrancy for the future. And now, the American Library Association, along with United for Libraries, welcomes Dan Rather for this National Library Week conversation with Booklist Donna, Seaman. Donna?
Thank you so much, Julius, and thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight to celebrate National Library Week and Take Action for Libraries Day. I know we could say that Dan Rather needs no introduction, but let me just tell you a little bit about Mr. Rather. He was born and raised in Texas, where he learned to love and cherish the revelations of both nature and books. His abiding curiosity about life and human endeavor propelled him to journalism. Dan Rather was on CBS News for many years, anchor and managing editor of CBS Evening News, appearing on 60 Minutes in 48 hours, getting my numbers confused. But after his celebrated career as a hard-hitting yet empathic, trusted and revered authority on CBS, Dan Rather launched Dan Rather Reports, an Emmy Award-winning magazine, and brought his ardor for delving conversations to the big interview. Not to simply stop with that, Dan Rather is also the founder, president, and CEO of News and Guts. I love that name. A news, media, and production company dedicated to insightful coverage and conversation. Dan Rather is also a prolific writer. He has 8 books to his credit, including Rather Outspoken, another great title, and the book we'll be discussing tonight, What Unites Us, Reflections on Patriotism, both in its original edition and a magnificent new graphic novel version, which I will hold up for a moment, just out. Dan's social media posts draw a tremendous and active audience. Dan has also launched a news and discussion website called Steady. We are so honored to have you here tonight as an advocate for libraries. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Rather.
Thank you very much, and I deeply appreciate that introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's a privilege and an honor to be here.
Let's begin with kind of a large question. You write that everywhere in the US, people of all ages head to libraries in large numbers to access a world of knowledge for free. You also write that libraries represent an aspirational notion of democracy. What role do libraries play in sustaining our democracy?
Well, as was mentioned in the early comments of some, and I do try to make this point, in fact, I try to emphasize the point in what unites us, is that in the system of government we have, which is a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy, and based on the principle of making a representative democracy, which means people vote. The whole system is, the foundation of it is informed citizens. That this system doesn't work, it can't work, it won't last if we don't have informed citizens. And the libraries, and anybody who knows their history, I'm not a history major, I'm your basic reporter, but you have to study history. That in our country, there's been a belief from the very beginning that you have to have informed citizens, or how best to do that. And we reached a point, particularly in the late 19th century, moving into the 20th century, where we understood that having libraries in every possible community location was vital to the country's ability to have its people be informed. That, for example, my parents, neither of whom finished high school, which sounds terrible, but in their time and place, Texas in the 1930s, this was not unusual, that they were self-educated, and they were quite well self-educated. One with the newspapers, and two with the library. That they both frequented libraries, checked books out of the library. I grew up in that kind of household, even though my father made his living with his back in his hands, and my mother worked as a waitress. At that level, my father always said of newspapers, he considered newspapers the poor man's university, and he considered libraries the poor man's graduate school. But this nexus of the absolute essential imperative of having an informed population. The libraries come into this nexus. They have for quite a while. And I would suggest that particularly in this time, a time where we've had, I started to say an outbreak, but we certainly had a movement from the very top leadership of the country for a while of anti-science, anti-fact, and really disinformation campaign. Never have libraries been more at this nexus of standing not only as a monument, but a living, active participant in keeping the public informed. I fully understand the argument that says, well, you know, Mr. Rather, we're now in the digital age. Young people go to social media, that libraries are about as outdated as I don't know, spats or something. Absolutely untrue. And I think when we talk about building a national consensus that libraries are an absolute imperative natural resource, that we need to talk up the idea. Listen, the idea is that libraries are old-fashioned. Anybody who makes that talk, first of all, has not been in a library lately. If you go to your local library, if you're one of those people who say to yourself, I think libraries have passed their time, they've had a time, then I urge you to go to the library. Because if you go to the library and spend any time there, you will see how false that information is. For example, here in Austin, I'm speaking to you tonight from Austin, where my family and I have spent some of our time when we're not in New York. Austin has a new, absolutely spectacular, outstanding new city main library, which is right up to 21st century standards. And it's a gathering place for the community, not just a place where you go to check out books or check books or read books. It's multidimensional. And this is true of many libraries around the country. So without wanting to talk the question to death, which I fear that I may have done, at that nexus, at that meeting point, where the need for an informed citizenry is imperative for the sustain of our government, sustaining the government, then that's where libraries are absolutely essential, and never more so than now. And right now, of course, there's a lot of competition for funding, and this is a critical time to fund and refund and fund our libraries to the maximum we can do it. There's certainly other priorities, but putting the libraries high on the list, which is one of the things I know this program is about, and is one of the reasons I'm glad to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Mr. Adder. And yes, it's true that libraries do still provide books to the public, and books come in so many different forms now, but they also provide so many other services, and their community anchors, their centers for discovery and innovation, and they have to adapt to meet changing needs of their communities. In your book, you mentioned the Andrew Carnegie libraries. Nearly 800 of the libraries financed by Andrew Carnegie more than a century ago are still in use, and many are in serious need of renovation. If you were able to testify to Congress about why they should pass this bill to allocate $5 billion to libraries, what would you tell our seated representatives?
Well, I tell them probably a shorter version than what I answered your first question about where libraries fit in and where they fit in historically in sustaining the present form of building. The second reason, in direct answer to this question, would say, you know, ladies and gentlemen, our representatives, that libraries have consistently demonstrated their value to our society, to our country and to our culture. That the fact that many of them, I would venture to say a very large percentage of them, are at the point where they have to have some money to bring themselves up to date. Otherwise, they will cease to exist. I don't think that's overdramatic, that the libraries will cease to exist if they don't get the funds to keep themselves at least reasonably up to date. So I would plead with Congress to recognize what an absolutely imperative resource libraries are. And when it comes to prioritizing where money goes, to make sure that we continue to support the libraries, which we have traditionally done. It's tailed off a little bit in recent years, I think, but traditionally we have done it. It's very part of, and forgive it if you must, I would argue that libraries are part of what unites us. And if we want to stay united, which is the constant challenge to our America, because we're multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-racial. We have to constantly be emphasizing those things that help unite us, and libraries, without question, are an important part of what keeps us united.
Yes, indeed. I'm so struck too by your emphasis on civic activity. You know, we've really learned that we can't take anything for granted, that nothing in a democracy can just run on its own, that it's up to us to keep it vital and protect it. And we see so many forces undermining democracy currently. You covered voter suppression in the 1960s, and here we are again. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sustaining our civic responsibilities and as that is a way to unite us, and also to help libraries.
Well, it's certainly a way to unite us. And again, I would say it's an absolutely critical, imperative part of our united. Look, when we have some real problems, obviously, and we have real divisions. So it's absolutely necessary. We keep saying to ourselves, well, with all these disagreements, with all these divisions, deep divisions, including problems of race, how do we keep ourselves united? Well, it's to say, let's make a list. Let's go down the list of things in which we do agree. And right up the top of everybody's list is one person, one vote. The absolute essential quality of every person has the right to vote. Every person gets to vote. One person, one vote is right at the foundation. Without that, we're not the United States of America. So it's not hard to extrapolate from that when you start a national movement to reduce the number of people who can get to the polls and vote, you start throwing up obstacles to people voting. This is anti-democratic in capital letters. And it speaks to that those who attempt to limit the availability of the vote to people, it shows the weakness of their policies. Because if you really believed in your policies, if you believed in the fundamentals of your party or your candidacy, you would want more people to go to the polls, not fewer people going to the polls. And the talk that, well, this is necessary for the integrity of the ballot is, frankly, it's bull. And anybody who stops and studies it and thinks about it for even 5 or 10 minutes will come to that conclusion. So again, when we have to say to ourselves, what's important to us? What holds us together? Well, one person, one vote. Everybody who's qualified to vote, get them to the polls. This is not only important to us, it's absolutely imperative to us. And anybody who makes the argument to the contrary. Now, one of the arguments, and let's not expand this too much, one of the arguments, well, there's voter fraud. Well, there's remarkably little voter fraud. When you look at the facts, when you look at the reality in this last election was remarkable in its integrity, and most of our elections are. So again, this talk of, well, this is really to guard against fraud and the corruption of the voting process. I think, again, anybody who looks into it will recognize how really false that is.
Indeed. You also, another force that's been undermined to some extent is our free and independent press. This is something, of course, you're deeply knowledgeable about. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what's the state of the press now and why it's so important that we have a fearless, independent press.
Well, first of all, I'm glad you asked, because I fear that those of us in journalism, including myself, have never been able to quite make the case strongly enough that this naturally is something that concerns journalists and certainly concerns me as a journalist. But this is something that's broader than journalism itself and just the practice of journalism and journalists. This has to do with the vitals of the country, because the following has been demonstrated time and time again. And almost every one of our national leaders through history, from George Washington forward, have said so in one way or the other, that a free and independent, fiercely independent when necessary press is the red beating heart of freedom and democracy. And you're not going to have freedom and democracy if you do not have a genuinely free press, as I say, a press with the guts to be fiercely independent when that's necessary. It's not a question just for journalists. It's not a question of our wanting to be self-serving about it. This is demonstrated time and again. Now, this happens from time to time. I'm sorry to say it just happened recently. It did just happen recently, but it happens from time to time that people who seek to gain power or stay in power for power's sake, they seek to divide us. And one of the ways that they found that they can make some headway is to say, listen, you don't like what's going on in the country, don't blame me, blame the press. The press is the problem. Their argument, and listen to this carefully because it on the face of it is so foolish to accept the argument. The argument of those who say, well, the press is the problem. They're arguing our problems are not the problems. The problems are these people in the press. Patently ridiculous. But again, from time to time, they do it. They're frequently the same people, these people who seek power or seek to stay in power. They seek other divisions, the divisions against race, to divide us racially. Difficult, very sensitive area with us, and one easy to exploit for people who seek to divide us. And there's a list of others, but the press is up there fairly high. I am encouraged by the fact that historically, while it certainly goes up and down from time to time, that the American people as a whole, I think they do realize the importance of a free and truly independent press. And what they're right to do is to demand a better performance from all of us, that we can do better in the press, we should do better. Journalism is not an exact science. It's on its best of days a kind of crude art. It's not an exact science. Nobody can do it perfectly. We all make mistakes. And I do think that some of us, including myself from time to time, we're not quick enough to acknowledge we make mistakes and try to explain to people, look, I'm doing the best I can, but there's no way to do it perfectly. I'm reminded that it used to be years ago in West Texas, Cowboy Towns, they had a sign up in the bar room and said, please don't shoot the piano player. He's doing the best he can. Well, some version of that is what I would like for people to judge the press. Forgive us our trespasses. We're doing the best we can.
Indeed. You use a great term in your book, curated knowledge, which made me think about the difference between responsible journalism and the glut of misinformation and disinformation that we find online. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how libraries have people and resources that can help clarify a lot of the lies and deceptions that are just swamping us on social media.
Well, absolutely. And one of the most often questions that I get asked and have been asked over the last few years is, where do you go for information? They want to know where journalists go for information. And I'll have a sort of a set talk in which I say for myself, when I absolutely positively have to have it, when it's breaking news or something, then I go to the Associated Press or Reuters, both in worldwide news gathering resources. But the library is the biggest collection of curated knowledge, which is truths and facts. That the best defense against this misinformation and the whole idea that, well, nothing is really factual, that facts are fungible, they're alternate facts. But flatly untrue, of course. Listen, 2 and 2 does not equal 7. Water does not run uphill. There are any number of things which is factual. But on the big facts, for example, what's happened in history, what happened before as a guide to what's happening today, libraries are the fount of it. And that's one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here tonight and talk about let's get front and center on funding our libraries. Let's preach the gospel of libraries are a great natural resource, an important natural resource. is this very thing. The best anecdote that I can think of to the sort of hurricanes of misinformation, lies, and straight out propaganda. Head for the library, get the quiet of the library, go to books, read books, and think carefully about what's being said. And it gives you your best chance to sort it out.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm going to turn to a question from one of our audience members, Janet Holly from Lexington, Virginia. And she has an interesting question. What was one story that you reported using information brought to you by a librarian?
I'm trying to pick one. There've been so many. I'm
I'll
thinking
bet.
a librarian. Well, I'd say that when I was still working in Houston, before I went to CBS News, Houston in those days, and it's true to this day, had some of the country's most stringent, well, it didn't have many zoning laws. Among big cities, I think it's still true, it certainly was true for a long time, that Houston was well known. It didn't have zoning laws, didn't kind of anti-zoning laws. Frankly, I was the news director at the local television station, and I didn't fully understand what a zoning law was, other than it just would allow you to build a service station in a residential neighborhood or something. And I went directly to the main library in downtown Houston. I've written in the book about the smaller library in my neighborhood, the Heights Library in Houston. But I went immediately to the main downtown library and talked to the library. I think she was the chief librarian. I don't remember. Anyway, I talked to her name and said, I need to give myself a short course on zoning because I think we need to do an hour-long documentary on zoning. And she said, by all means. And she just pulled my chair up right there and she made a reading list for me, a quick reading list on the history of zoning generally, the history of zoning in Houston and so forth. And that was the foundation of turning out what I thought was, for its time and place, a pretty good documentary on whether Houston did or did not need stronger zoning laws.
That's a great example. You spoke to, well, I want to address science now. We're in a time of climate change denial. We're also in the midst of a pandemic where vaccines are crucial to our survival and getting through this, but there's a lot of vaccine hesitation and refusal. I wonder if you could talk about science literacy and why that's so important. And again, this goes back to all the things that libraries help us with.
All the things that library help us with, and another very important thing that unites us. When we ask ourselves the question, what unites us? Science is one of the things that what unites us. And this has been true since the very beginning of the country. Again, the very first leaders of the country. We're talking about the Washingtons, the Adams, the Jeffersons. Right from the start, they realized if this noble experiment, our beloved United States of America, was going to make it, this new thing in history that most of the world thought wouldn't last, couldn't last, the leaders from the beginning realized that the country had to try to develop a leadership role in the development of science. This was true right after the country was founded, when you had very little science. The great centers of science at that time were in Paris and in London and Germany and other places. But we have to understand that right the way through our history, in every era, it has been, listen, we have to be constantly driving to be among leaders in science. Now we finally broke through and became as good of leaders in science as almost anybody in the world in the late 19th century, going into the early 20th century. And in the 20th century, we became leaders in science. If we stop and think about it, we all know that if we don't continue to be among the world's very best leaders in science, and preferably the leader in science, then we are not going to be nearly the country we have been. We're not going to be the country of our fathers and mothers and their fathers and mothers. We will fall behind. Now, with libraries, there's never in every community, the principal central resource for information about science is likely to be in the local library. And if it's not in the community library, it's likely to be in the main library downtown, wherever that may be. And the word is appalling for what's happened in the last 4 or 5 years. We've actually had some of the top leaders in the country, including the top leader in the country, anti-science. And we see the reverberations of it with the coronavirus. Vaccines can't be trusted. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the polio vaccine. Polio was every mother's nightmare. We got a vaccine for polio, and now I can't say it's unheard of, but practically wiped it out. But developing this movement of anti-science is very dangerous to the vitals of the country. And when we talk about where libraries fit in, here once again, as I say, if someone is interested in studying vaccines, where is the best place for them to go? I know some people are going to say, well, I'll get up on my gadget and I'll punch it up and get it on the internet. No denying that that's a valuable resource. By the way, in parentheses, don't forget your local library is fully plugged in. Technology is there. But the libraries and they keep us up to date with science, and they're a reservoir of information from the past, and there's no substitute for them. I'm glad you raised the science thing, because when I worry about the country, I'm an optimist by nature and by experience. But when I worry about the country, one of the things I worry about is the inroads that the anti-science movement has made. That's perilous for the country.
Yes, thank you so much. And people develop sort of fear of science, I think. But there's so much narrative, popular science to read, so many great books explaining, life, and it's so important to see ourselves within the larger web of life. That's what unites us. It unites us to the planet. So this is something really important. Citizen science, as Edward O. Wilson talks about, is such an important movement.
Well, it is true that some people get scared off of science. And I can remember the first time I was introduced to chemistry. I might as well have been speaking Swahili or High Norse. I understood almost nothing, but I was always glad that I had the chemistry class in both high school and college. I went to a teacher's college that required having 1 year of chemistry. And while I didn't retain much of the knowledge of chemistry, it helped me to overcome my fear of chemistry. And mostly it taught me what it is scientists are trying to do. And that was valuable. But we won't spend all of our time on science, but I just remind, if you have a fear of science, go to the local library, ask the librarian, or look up a book on Introduction to Science, fundamental, elemental introduction to science. Again, I recognize somebody can say, well, I'll get up on my iPhone and get it. But it's different reading on the iPhone. Go to the library, get an introduction to science, read 2 books on introduction to science, and your fear of science, I bet you would disappear.
I love it. So the sister to science is art, and I know you have a deep interest in art, and it's certainly a unifying force. Do you want to speak about that a little bit?
Well, again, we say one of the things that unites us is science, a belief in science. Another thing that unites us is art. That not in the same way, and perhaps not to the degree that we spoke about science, but again, from the beginning, the country has wanted to develop an appreciation of art. Mind you, I didn't say an appreciation of fine art necessarily. That art, music is art, painting is art, sculpture is art. But the soul of a country, of any country, this was true of the ancient Babylonians and Greeks. It's been true through history. that you can judge the soul of a country frequently by their attitude toward art. And again, we talk about repositories of art, not just great art, but art at almost every level. It's hard to beat your local library as a repository of knowledge about it. Not necessarily they have the great pieces of art, but they can help you understand art. They can expand your definition, well, of what you understand about art. Again, I'm going to come back to it. Yes, you can look it up on the iPhone, but it's not the same as going into the library, accepting the silence of the library, and dig deep into somewhere there's a book that will turn you on to art as you've never been turned on before. But back to your question, that art speaks to us in ways that nothing else expresses. In that sense, poetry is another, of course. That, yes, you can read all the prose you want, but poetry, if you really listen to it, it has a voice unique to itself, and art has a voice unique to itself. For me, keep in mind, I'm married to a painter, that my wife, Jean Rather, is an accomplished professional painter, but one of the things that she has taught me is that it's not just what the art brings to you, it's what you bring to the art. When you look at a painting, what are you bringing to the painting? Not just looking at the painting to say something to you. If you take it as a whole and take entertainment, which encompasses the arts, how really dreary life would be without art. All kinds of art is one way to look at how important it is, and answering the question, you bet art helps unites us.
Beautifully put. Thank you so much. So art is also a forum for tremendous diversity. And I have a question from a participant on that subject. The question is, you talk about the feast of diversity we find in today's libraries when you describe how the breadth of ideas we consider vital for our national identity has expanded. How has our national identity expanded, and this is a different question, and what role do the libraries play in that expansion? And then the second half of that is very interesting. This is from Trevor Golden in Silver Spring, Maryland. So we're talking about the expansion of our national identity. How do we get those who fear demographic change to see their commonality with those of us who represent that change?
Well, let me try to take the two big questions. We can spend the rest of the evening talking about them. Rest assured, we're not. We'll move on to other things. But I think the first question, I'll try to answer them in order. But the first question is, how did we get to where we are now in terms of diversity? Well,
yeah.
We've struggled with this question since the very beginning of the country. But the biggest sea change that affects what's happening to us at this particular moment, I think, and many people are unaware of this, came with the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. Now, follow me here, that President Lyndon Johnson had pushed through the Congress the most important civil rights legislation since the time of Lincoln in the middle 1800s. As a natural growth of that, it focused a great deal on improving civil rights for people with African-American heritage. And as a growth of that was to say, well, we should do the same for other races with immigration. We had immigration limits. So only so many people could come from this area and more people come from another. So without very much fanfare, the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 was passed, in which quotas were wiped out. It said, listen, we're open to people from any place on earth. We don't say we're trying to get more from Western Europe than we do from Asia. And nobody at the time, including President Johnson, realized how great and how quickly this would change the demographic makeup of the country, to which now we reach here in the We're entering the third decade of the 21st century. Demographically, we are a dramatically different demographic makeup than we were in the mid 60s. And this has caused a lot of reflection of people saying, well, was this a good idea or not a good idea? I'm not saying that's not worth considering, but whatever one thinks, whether it was a good idea or not, the here and now is there are much more diverse. We are much more diverse people than we were, and much more diverse than we have ever been. And that leads to was it Trevor in Maryland? The question
Yes, yes, Trevor Golding.
Of how do we get people to accept it? Not easily is the answer. This is, if not the greatest challenge to our national unity at the moment, certainly one of the greatest challenges is to find ways to have people of different races, different creeds, different religions, different ethnicity, different color, to look at people as individuals, not as groups. You know, Martin Luther King, in one of his great quotes, said, "We must judge a man by the quality of his character, not by the color of his skin." That it isn't going to be easy. The answer, how do we do it, isn't going to be easy. But I do think that because we're saying, let's see each and every person as an individual, and judge that person by their character, not by some perceived character or a whole race of people. The other is to, and I do think that libraries can be very helpful in this regard, of emphasizing that we must always be on guard. We must be protected against people who seek to divide us for their own partisan, political, and or ideological gains. We've seen a lot of this in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly, and we saw some before that, and we will see some again. That is, people who say, look, the country's changed so much demographically. A lot of people are uncomfortable with that. A lot of people aren't prepared to see past the group into the individual, so we can exploit that for our partisan, political, and ideological gain. Now, again, we're talking about libraries, and you say, well, how are libraries going to fit into that? Again, the curated knowledge in libraries of how other civilizations have handled this, how we've handled it and mishandled it in the past. Libraries are a repository of our basic information about that.
Thank you so much. It's complicated, but you really find a way to encapsulate it.
It is complicated. I do think it's, this is my own opinion, clearly, that when the history of our beloved United States of America is written, 3,000, 5,000, whenever the final history is written, the final line is on us is going to be how we handled the problem of race. That'll be the final line in how we're judged as a civilization, as a society, wherever down the road that history is written. It's going to be the last paragraph and the last lines will be how we handled the mixing of races.
That makes me think about how rapidly, comparatively, things changed when it comes to gay rights. That seems, if you read about the history of that, from just criminalized attitudes about lesbian and gay and trans people, and how that just changed in this sort of revolutionary, like before our very eyes, with same-sex marriage and other anti-discrimination. I mean, it's still a fight, there's still problems, but that seems in a kind of a contrast to the racial struggles.
Well, and it's one of the encouraging things about our country. But while underscoring that there's still much to be done, we're talking about what's generally called gay rights. It's same as there's so much to be done with civil rights having to do with race. But one of the encouraging things about our country, and I recognize there are plenty of things that can be discouraging for people, is that we have the capacity for changing in our country. And one of the things that unites us, part of what unites us is a belief that we Americans, we're constantly striving, and we want to be constantly striving to be better, to, in the words of the founding fathers, to reach a more perfect union. We recognize that it never can be perfect, but we're always moving toward the polar star of trying to make it better. And sometimes this happens much more quickly than anybody could even imagine or dream. That when I was covering the early stages of the civil rights movement and Dr. Martin Luther King in the early 1960s, you know, after midnight when reporters got together over an adult beverage, keeping in mind politicians, hangmen, and journalists do their best work after midnight, and talk about, did we ever think we would see a Black person be, say, a governor of Georgia? It was almost unanimous, not in our lifetime. Will we ever see a president of the United States? Virtually, consensus was never, not going to happen, certainly not going to happen. Well, I'll use that as an example because while certainly we have a long way yet to go, we're long past the point where you've had people of color be governors, senators, congressmen, and yes, we had a president elected and re-elected to 2 terms. And with gay rights, you mentioned, I, for one, did not expect in my lifetime to see things move as quickly and in the right direction as much as they have. I thought, yes, it'll come sometime, but probably not in my lifetime. So these are encouraging signs. And when we get down, we need to think about those things in which we have changed and keep trying to change. Now with libraries, again, if you want to know the history, and the history is not pretty on such things as civil rights in general, gay rights, and a long history, it may be a little hard to find it in other places, but your local library has that history. Now, I can hear some voices saying, well, Dan, be careful, because in the period from which we've just come, that is heavy prejudice against people who are gay, there was an effort to keep books that dealt with the subject out of libraries. And for a long time, libraries were no doubt misrepresented with books on this subject, but that's not the case today, you can bet.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is books are still being banned. And I also just want to say that there's such backlash to any progress that we make. And we need to recognize that. For people involved in these struggles, it doesn't seem quick, I know. And I've really, you know, come to see how there's nothing linear. You might take a step back, but there's such a backlash. You get pulled back so quickly. So it's a constant effort. And you write about this so eloquently. And it goes back to, you know, never taking anything for granted. That small progress can be undermined very, very quickly and tragically. So we need to stay together. Libraries are a place where we can continually refresh our understanding of what's happened in the past and what's happening now. So it's because things are difficult and complicated, we need those community centers, those anchors where we can go to learn about the facts. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I want to get another participant question in here. We were talking about digital developments and how libraries have adapted so tremendously, probably more than a lot of people who don't use libraries often understand how much they've changed. But you yourself, Mr. Rather, have also evolved and adapted in your approach to news. And M. Jones from New Hope, Pennsylvania, wrote to us to ask you this. Mr. Rather, you are relatively new to Twitter, but have already garnered an impressive following with your wit and charm. What are your views on Twitter and other social media in the literary ecosystem? And And what role can they play in the evolving notion and survival of the community library, in quotes? So library in a large sense.
Well, what a good question. I don't know that I'll have a satisfactory answer, but we'll say, first of all, about Twitter, I consider Twitter fun. It's not basically a place I go for much information. It's not to say that I don't get some information on Twitter, but basically Twitter it's fun for me. And it also, quite honestly, it helps me keep up to date with what's on people's minds. Well, always in my mind is the knowledge that not everybody in the country is on Twitter. Not everybody goes to social media. There's a tendency, once you get into social media, once you start playing with Twitter or going to Twitter or Facebook, you begin to believe that everybody in the whole country has access to Facebook and Twitter. Not true. But for example, to try to keep up with pop culture, which is very difficult for me. I'm not complaining, I say it with a smile, but it's just, you know, it's hell being 89 years old and trying to stay hip.
I think you do it.
But Twitter has been an education for me, among other things, with social media. And also I like the sense of community in Twitter. While, you know, you're limited to short writings and all, there is a sense of community, which I like. Same thing with Facebook, which is another part of social media. I like the sense of community. And then there are other platforms in social media. There's something called Steady, which I have recently joined, which you can develop a community within these platforms. So that's where they fit in. But I would say this, there is the dangerous side of it. And that is the danger of social media, particularly young people. And I don't want to be, well, the old man is trying to convince young people of that, but it's a danger of saying, well, I get my news off social media. That's basically where I get my news, quote unquote. Very, very dangerous. And it's also, there are other things, the anonymity sometimes can be very hurtful in some way. But if you weigh all sides of it, I think probably I will weight it toward the plus side. But with libraries, that library is the anti-Twitter, if you will. I don't think librarians are going to appreciate putting it that way because they're fearful of how that will play with young minds that they would like to have in libraries. But somewhere you have to develop a depth of knowledge. And you're not going to get that on social media. You're going to get that at the library. And it occurs to me that I don't think there's any chance of this happening. But as far as I'm concerned, we ought to make sure that every child in school, certainly before they get out of the third grade, is taken to a local library. I recognize the school has its own libraries, which is good. But I would vote for taking the child to a library, partly because that's what happened to me at a very young age, and thank God that, and the librarians that it did. And the other is to require state legislators and members of Congress to go in a library at least once a year, just walk in, introduce themselves, say that 15 to 20 minutes. I don't think either of these things is likely to happen, but it wouldn't hurt if they did.
That is a perfect way to conclude this conversation. I'm looking at the clock in dismay because we have run out of time. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Rather, for being here as part of National Library Week and our Take Action for Libraries Days. Thank you so much for your advocacy and all your good work and care.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and honor to be with you. And thank you, Donna, Seaman, and thanks everybody involved. Thank you, everybody.